In 2013, Nvidia released a graphics card that would change the world. The Geforce Titan made us rethink graphics cards in the modern era, specifically how much they were worth. Sure, GPUs had been expensive before, and they'd been premium before, but Titan was different. That one word was to capture an audience who hadn't been specifically catered to before. The discerning, the refined, the whales. I have a mixed relationship with the Nvidia Titan series. Aside from the obvious track record an Iceberg would have with things named Titan, I do run a primarily consumer-focused channel, and premium GPUs like the Titan range always have a certain anti-consumer air about them. Nevertheless, I am also morbidly fascinated by the concept of luxury computer components. In PC tech, there really isn't any such thing as appreciation. If you have the money, you might buy a luxury car, or watch, or home, or art piece in the knowledge that it will gain value over time, or that it will add to your social value by owning it. But graphics cards only increase in value in rare and terrible circumstances. We'd had expensive graphics cards before the Titan, of course, special editions of GPUs with overkill cooling and power delivery for extreme modding and overclocking, or cards with 2 GPUs on a single PCB. They were expensive, but justifiably so. Cards built for competitive overclocking weren't going to sell in large numbers, so production costs were necessarily higher. Dual GPU cards had high price tags, but compared to buying 2 cards, they could actually be pretty reasonable. Nvidia's main justifications for the Titan's $1,000 asking price were its massive 6GB of VRAM and its 2,688 CUDA cores, about 15% more than the $650 GTX 780. As impressive as these stats are, they would be surpassed after only a few months. The GTX 780 Ti would offer more CUDA cores for less money before the end of 2013, and the first consumer 8GB GPU would be launched by Sapphire in 2014. While the 780 Ti's extra cores probably broke a few Titan owners' hearts, mainstream games wouldn't even need 6GB of VRAM for several more years, and so the Titan's biggest benefit was for specific productivity niches and, of course, bragging rights. Unlike previous expensive cards, the Titan's implied target market was the wealthy PC owner, someone who had to have the most VRAM and highest core count regardless of cost. I was still selling cameras in 2013, and I know exactly who the Titan's for. It was for the customer who bought the Canon 1DS and the L-series Holy Trinity just to take holiday snaps. They probably live in the suburbs but drive a Jeep. Of course, regular tech nerds presumably bought Titans too, as it was the best single GPU card available to consumers between February and November of 2013, and those people would probably have been somewhat disappointed that it held on to the top spot for such a short time. Rich PC owners might have felt similarly, or else maybe they just assumed this is how it's supposed to go, and forked out for the Titan Black the following February. Regardless, in 2023, I don't think many of these old Kepler cards are still in regular use. You see, time hasn't been kind to the Titan. You might have seen my positive coverage on its contemporaries, like the R9 290X, and presumed it would have aged equally well. Or maybe that it's like the Titan X, but slower and with less VRAM. Well, sadly, neither of these is the case. The first Titan, along with its 2 immediate successors, and in fact the entire Nvidia range in the early 2010s, was built on Kepler architecture. This was a big step up for Nvidia at the time. Their previous generation Fermi cards were dramatically less efficient. The Titan had a 250W TDP, only 6 watts higher than the old GTX 580, but had 87% higher performance according to Tech PowerUp. Compared to what came before, Kepler was awesome. Alas, it wouldn't remain so for long. The winds of change were blowing in the world of gaming. DirectX 12 and Mantle, later replaced by Vulkan, were low-level APIs that would go on to become extremely important to the future of gaming, but which the Titan didn't natively support. For at least the first few years, this didn't make much of a difference. DX12 was kind of a joke, usually being optional in most games, and often causing a sizable hit in performance for little or no benefit. That state of affairs didn't last, however. In the last couple of years, we've started to see more and more games that require full DX12 feature support. Nvidia did retroactively enable DX12 on Kepler, and that might have improved compatibility somewhat, but it didn't add the ability to run DX12 features, and that meant that its alleged compatibility was very much surface level. Those games that required DX12 and 12.1 feature support, or even 11.1 in the case of God of War, wouldn't work with Kepler cards at all, at least not without some user-made mods and workarounds, some of which worked, some didn't. Competing Radeons from this era had DX12 feature support from the get-go, and AMD were instrumental in the development of Mantle and Vulkan, all of which seemingly contributed to their cards aging better than Kepler in the long run. Overall, the situation in a post-DX11 world looked pretty dire for the Titan. All that being said, it's still a former flagship GPU, and a decade in computer development isn't as long as it used to be. To see how well it's held up over time, and whether it can still perform, I'm testing the Titan in a series of games from around the time that it launched up to, well, as recent as I can get in the circumstances. My choice of settings might be a little anachronistic. The 4K standard was only set in 2012, and the Titan didn't have access to niceties like HDMI 2, so even a card like this would probably not have been used for 4K gaming. Nevertheless, I have a whopping 6GB of VRAM to play with, so I'm damn well going to give it a try. My test platform is also slightly anachronistic. The Xeon E5 1650v3 was released about 9 months after the Titan, and combined with 32GB of quad-channel RAM, it makes for quite an overkill gaming PC for the early 2010s. But it's appropriate to the spirit of the Titan, and importantly, it's still fairly capable today. In fact, I've made a whole video comparing 2014-era Xeons in modern games, which you might want to watch after this one. The Titan landed at the end of the 7th console generation, so plenty of PC ports at the time looked like Dishonored, a 2012 first-person assassination game from Arcane. As a game designed for the relatively feeble hardware in the Xbox 360, this PC can run it at max settings without breaking a sweat, which, as the PC would have cost like 10 times as much as a console, I think that's fair enough. 4K gaming might not have been a thing in 2012, but if it had been, the Titan could have handled it at a mighty 117 FPS. The lows would have been higher, except I hit a boundary somewhere and caused a loading stutter. Far Cry 3 was a very different matter. Although Crytek had nothing to do with this sequel, there's still a clear commitment from Ubisoft Montreal to make a game that was as taxing on PCs of 2012 as the original game was on machines in 2004. That is to say, even with this, the best single GPU card available a year later, you can't simply whack all the quality settings to max and expect a playable frame rate. At 4K, the Titan is passing the 30 FPS mark. Just. Dropping to 1440p is more realistic, though falls short of a 60 FPS average, and so would probably benefit from a couple of tweaked settings. In reality though, 1440p wasn't a common resolution in 2013 either, and 1080p gamers could indeed have cranked everything to max and even added 2x multi-sample anti-aliasing, and still got an 80 FPS average with lows only slightly below 60. Tomb Raider 2013 was a favourite of benchmarkists at the time, however it was released a few months after the Titan, so of course most of the initial reviews don't feature it. The Ultra preset isn't the maximum setting available, the Ultimate setting is exactly the same but adds TressFX hair simulation. This one setting can annihilate performance on GeForces, so I guess Ultra will have to do. At 4K, the game isn't unplayable, but it's not great either. Average FPS doesn't even reach 40, and 1% lows are only a touch over the 30 mark. 1440p is a much easier target, and is surprisingly smooth, considering only the resolution was changed. Averages are now over 80, and lows are bang on 70. With that in mind, for the 1080 run I added some SSAA, which, like MSAA, can absolutely wreck performance and is definitely something the devs intended for future hardware, as the best of the best in the first half of 2013 could only manage 64 FPS with lows of 52. My second title for 2013 was the very popular and very pretty Bioshock Infinite. Like Dishonored, there's a strong aroma of console port about this one, but with a grander scale and finer details. This means that, despite being able to scale down to fit on a 360, it can also be quite taxing on the high-end PC hardware of the day. 4K 60 isn't going to happen without dropping quality settings from maximum, but then again, it wouldn't have happened in 2013 anyway. 1440p, like in Tomb Raider, is surprisingly much better, to the tune of over 100% higher FPS. Averages are an excellent 104, and lows of 87 mean you could happily use a 60 or 75 FPS lock if you so wished. On the subject of FPS caps, 2014's Wolfenstein sequel/reboot The New Order has one. According to the PC Gaming Wiki, it can be removed, but the game's pretty buggy without it, so I made the executive decision to leave it in place. Anyway, at 4K Ultra you couldn't even tell. I didn't get round to doing a proper benchmark run, but it looked like it was averaging somewhere in the 40s. Dropping to 1440p is all you really need to hit the cap, and the game becomes immensely more playable in the process. For my second 2014 title, I went back to Shadow of Mordor. This one can be pretty damn demanding on era-appropriate GPUs, especially Kepler. A dual GPU GTX 690 at 4K Ultra was a slideshow even in the menu due to its relative lack of VRAM, whereas the Titan can not only navigate the menu at max settings, it can actually give a 30 plus average FPS. This is still kinda unplayable, however, so some sacrifices would have to be made for 4K. At 1440p, it's pretty close to a smooth 60 FPS at Ultra, but if you're a stickler for 60, it should only require a step down to high. And 1080p should be no challenge at all. Interestingly, the system actually allocates all of the available VRAM to the game, so this is one of the few times I actually saw the VRAM usage go that high. However, while Shadow of Mordor was pretty memory hungry for its day, the game was actually using much less than 6GB, so a 3GB card like the 780 Ti would probably have still been okay with the textures dropped. The big name release of 2015 was the long-awaited PC port of GTA 5, a game which many of you will probably have forgotten about. I'm kidding, of course, but apparently when I call GTA 5 stuff like a sleeper hit or an indie title, that doesn't always come across. My bad. Anyway, the Titan can't quite do 4K at very high. It's mostly playable, though I would definitely recommend against using keyboard and mouse for driving, but grassy areas are the reason why this minimum frame rate is so low. At 1440p, the game does really well, without the need to compromise on settings, though again, the grass and trees tend to mess things up in that regard. In the long run, I could probably see myself dropping a couple of settings just for the sake of smoothness, but this isn't a bad experience at all. There's a reason I don't test rally games all that much. They suck and I hate them. And I hate them because I suck at them. Mercifully, 2015's Dirt Rally has a built-in benchmark, so I can tell you that the Titan can do a mighty fine job here. 4K Ultra is a bit heavy at 46 FPS, with minimums of about 40, but 1440p Ultra almost doubles that, averaging 83, and with lows of... Actually, as this is a racing game, I finally have a reason to explain why I always say 69 instead of 69. It's actually a reference to the cinematic masterpiece Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby. My French accent might not be quite as good as Sacha Baron Cohen's, but I do my humble best. Things really started to change in gaming in 2016, certainly visually. The Titan isn't completely useless in the Doom reboot, but 4K is out of the question, and a smooth 60 FPS is going to require a few dropped settings even at 1440p. The bulk of the gameplay I tested was in the 50s and 60s at Ultra, but some areas could see significant drops into the 30s and 40s, so I think it might be time to bite the bullet and start dropping from the maximum quality preset. 2017's Assassin's Creed Origins is certainly a step too far for the Titan. Ubisoft's open world games have always been demanding, and Origins carries that trend on. At 1440 very high, the built-in benchmark can only manage 32 FPS, and lows are a mere 25. By this point in history, the OG Titan had been superseded by 5 different newer models, and the 2017 Titan XP was capable of running at 4K Ultra at 52 FPS and 1440 Ultra at 81. By contrast, the now 4-year-old Kepler card needs dropping to 1080 very high to maintain a constant 30+. Forza Horizon 4, like its younger sibling, is generally a pretty smooth experience, even on older hardware. I say older, the Titan was released only 5 years before this game, making it about as old then as the 2080 Ti is now. At 1440 high, the benchmark is a fairly smooth 50 FPS average and 40 FPS minimum. Dropping to 1080p doesn't quite hit 60, but it's pretty close, and would only need reducing to medium to push it over the line. While grabbing footage for this video, I got a bit sad for a moment. I put dozens of hours into this game, and one day it'll be gone. Either I'll stop paying for Game Pass, or Microsoft will pull the game from distribution, and that'll be it. Ain't modern gaming great? 2023's Jedi Survivor isn't compatible with the Titan's architecture. However, its 2019 predecessor isn't so picky. It also happens to be one of my favourite games of all time. Being a good Star Wars game shouldn't be a high bar to clear, but evidently it is, and Fallen Order is possibly the only one I've enjoyed since Rogue Squadron 2, or maybe KOTOR. Performance is averaging in the high 30s at 1440 high, and about 60 at 1080 high. Its sequel has a reputation for being a bit of a crappy performer, but interestingly, the Titan XP performs about the same in that game as the older Titan does in this one. Only with more stutters, of course. Moving into the 2020s, and I don't really have a lot to show you here, the Titan's Kepler architecture and lack of up-to-date drivers has become a problem for pretty much every major release of the last 2 or 3 years. Here's The Last of Us, Resident Evil 4, Spider-Man, Ratchet & Clank. Forza Horizon 5 used to work on Kepler, but after a game update a while back, it doesn't anymore. With 2020 seemingly being the cutoff date for Kepler-compatible games then, I chose to revisit Horizon Zero Dawn. I didn't expect the Titan to perform well in this title from an FPS perspective, but I was curious. From past experience, I found that Kepler cards exhibited pretty severe visual artifacts, and I wondered if one of the game or driver updates of the last couple of years had possibly fixed it. Well, as you can see, no, they haven't. I ran the built-in benchmark anyway, just to have something to say. At 1440 original, the game runs at 36 FPS, and at 1080 that climbs to 49, but it's not the FPS that makes the game unplayable. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, really. Back in 2020 and 2021, I used to run Cyberpunk at low settings on older cards than this one, but after seeing almost every title I own from the last 2 years fail to launch with the Titan installed, it's still something of a relief that Cyberpunk 2077 even runs. Even better, this actually isn't unplayable. At 1080 low with high textures, the VRAM isn't being overburdened, and the average FPS is a low but acceptable 33. FSR upscaling produces a black screen, so about the only way to get better performance is to drop native resolution below 1080p. But if for some reason you're still rocking the OG Titan in 2023, that might be worth a try. There aren't a lot of 2023 games that will even run on the Titan. Maybe Baldur's Gate 3, I believe that's a DX11 game, but I actually haven't picked it up yet, and I've spent far too much on games lately to pay full price for it. Fingers crossed for a Christmas sale. Mercifully, there is one big popular 2023 title that runs on DX11 and doesn't cost a penny to play. In fact, you're better off playing Counter-Strike 2 at low settings anyway, so it's a perfect title for a 10-year-old graphics card. It's a little sad that CS2 pretty much averages 144 FPS in Dust 2 at 1080 low. The first game in the review could hit over 100 FPS at 4K max. Sign of the times, I guess. The Titan, then. It was truly a miracle of its day, but its day would prove to be too short. As well as the more identifiable problems like the lack of modern, low-level API support, there was also a persistent conspiracy theory among Kepler owners, one that might not be completely without merit. It was said that Nvidia was purposefully degrading Kepler performance with subsequent driver updates, either by failing to include optimizations for new games, or, some said, deliberately dialing back performance. It was pretty controversial. People published tests to prove it was happening, and others were doing tests to prove it wasn't. Whatever the truth of it, what can be shown and measured is that competing AMD GCN2 cards aged much more gracefully than Kepler. My friends over at Hardware Lab did an in-depth comparison between the R9 290X and the GTX 780 Ti last year, and their video is linked below. Despite its short reign at the top of the gaming stack, the original Titan had a fundamental impact on the graphics card market. 10 years before Titan, no gamer would even dream of spending that kind of money on a graphics card. 10 years later, the majority can only dream of it. Titan was aspirational. It was a status symbol for so-called whales, a dream GPU for nerds on a budget, and a halo product for Nvidia. Team Green were now the makers of $1,000 gaming GPUs. And even if they only sold a handful of units, its presence at the top of the range helped elevate the brand's reputation and opened the floodgates for what followed. Now, at the end of 2023, Nvidia has 2 gaming GPUs, all selling at $1,000 and higher, and none of them are branded Titan, meaning there's always room for something even bigger and more expensive at the top, and someone will buy it. The next time I revisit the Titan series, I plan on taking a break from the Keplers and instead focus on the Maxwell Titan X. In the meantime, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.